racist positions is a justification of racism. Racism is a centuries-old pandemic that dehumanizes humanity. My goals are, on one hand, to collaborate with the construction of stronger arguments in the fight against racism. On the other hand, to identify contradictions and forms of inadvertent racism that appear even among those who attempt to fight against racism nowadays. My ideas and arguments addressed to those that still justify racism are different. And these are going to be the part of this talk. And so I'm going to start with the introduction. Most Latin American republics have not entirely confronted colonial structures, systems of beliefs and practices of racial, cultural, religion, gender, and class oppression that were imposed upon indigenous and African people in the Americas. This failure is one of the greatest obstacles to the democratization of the region. Against this background, movements that have foregrounded the struggles of indigenous and Afro-descendants in the last century, together with human rights organizations and the United Nations, have allowed to design of political and legal tools for the vindication of the cultural, economic, and political rights within their respective citizenships. Key moments to establish these international political and legal tools have been the ratification of the 169 International Labour Organization Convention on Indigenous and Tribal People in 1989, and the program of action made at the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, in 2001. The 169 Convention demands that nations protect aspirations of these people to exercise control over their own institutions, ways of life, and economic development, and to maintain and develop their identities, language, and religions within the framework of the states in which they live. And Durban Program of Action urged nation states to establish and implement without delay national policies and plans of actions to fight racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and particular gender-based manifestations. Later, the United Nations declared the 2005-2014 period as the second international decade of the world's indigenous people. In 2007, the UN promulgated the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Finally, the UN proclaimed the period 2015-2024 as the International Decade for People of African Descent. All these supranational conferences denounce racism and express the ethical imperative of democratization despite all this, most Latin American countries did not heed these recommendations, even when they participate in signing these resolutions. In many cases, these were instead resisted by policymakers that regulate cultural recognition, economic redistribution, and political participation based on racial ethnic hierarchies. The Peruvian government, like the majority of the Americas, has signed this convention platform and program of action, as well as the declarations. Since 1993, the Peruvian Constitution, written under the Fujimori dictatorship, affirmed the social diversity of the country and attempt to guarantee the right of recognition of different ethnic and cultural identities. On paper, the Fujimori's government agreed to Article 2, all individuals have the right to their ethnic and cultural identity. The state recognizes and protects the ethnic and cultural diversity of the nation. While the Peruvian state has taken some actions in the way of guaranteeing indigenous and Afro-Peruvian rights, it has become evident that the government's attempt at actions are not rooted in a clear understanding of the stories, ideologies, and structures that have supported the oppression of Afro-descendant and indigenous Peruvians. In this presentation, I will explore the contradictions and paradoxes in state official discourse that attempt to confront racial injustices. This presentation is motivated by the question, how can Peruvian society and the state overcome these contradictions and paradoxes? Racism has constructed hierarchies among social groups using phenotypes or blood relations as symbol of essential differences in their moral, intellectual, emotional, spiritual, and body capabilities. This essentialism discards the process of social construction of identities. As many philosophers have examined, the sense of identity emerges and is forged from relationships and dialogues across life. The philosopher Charles Taylor affirms in Politics of Recognition that identity is not something done at birth. It is built through interactions or negotiations inside our private and public communities. This process is mainly oriented toward the recognition of our dignity. The philosopher Axel Honneth, in Struggle for Recognition, affirms that this intersubjective process seeks to satisfy our needs of self-confidence, self-respect, and self-esteem. The feminist philosopher Iris Marion Young, in Justice and Politics of Difference, add another trait of individual identities. They are plural. In other words, they depend on our group memberships in each social context. Each person has different identities in each context. For example, the same person is middle class, Christian, non-heterosexual, young, and so on. Each context is building its own categories and even its own way to apply international categories. For example, a person who self-identifies as Black and is identified as Black in the context of the US society can be identified as white in Nigeria, Brazil, or other countries. The opposite is also possible. Somebody who is identified as white in many other countries can be identified as Black in the US. This happens with all social identities, depending on what is the context. In fact, indigenous, Irish, Italian, Arab identities in the US can be challenged in countries where these ethnicities are majority. All social categories depend on a particular cultural, historical context for their interpretation and application. However, when racist ideologies define race as a matter of blood, they are asserting that the self of each person does not derive from social interactions and cultural contexts. They are affirming that moral, intellectual, emotional, spiritual, and body capabilities of a person are determined by its lineage. For these ideologies, race is not related to collective and individual experiences. Race is something that remains through historical changes. Therefore, race is taught as something transhistorical, something that is essential in our identities. The cultural theorist Stuart Hall develops a lengthy refutation of this racial essentialism in the Faithful Triangle. The Peruvian state, like most Latin American states, has emphasized the mestizo identity of the nation since the beginning of the 20th century. However, this mestizaje has not been exempted from racial essentialism. Different intellectuals were defining the national identity through their publications and debates. Some of them were the conservative historian José de la Riva Agüero, who defended the concept of blood as property innate, constitutive of the moral and spiritual qualities of individuals. For him, the Spanish blood was the carrier of excellent qualities. The blood laws and institutions of Spain brought European civilization of this soil and create and shape the sense of modern Peru, the barbarian empire that the Castilian conquerors encountered, whose children in large part have been mixed with those of the Spanish conquerors and contribute to the common war and defense. This was at the beginning of the 20th century. But even progressive Peruvian thinkers are affected by these essentialist notions about race. The most influential Peruvian Marxist intellectual during the 20th century, José Carlos Mariátegui, wrote in 7 essays on Peruvian reality. When he, Negro, has mixed with the Indian, it has been to bastardize him by communicating his flattering domesticity and his externalizing and morbid psychology. For his former white master, he has kept after his manumission a feeling of addict freedman. Colonial society, which made the domestic black very rarely an artisan, a worker, absorb and assimilate the black woman until intoxicated with her tropical and hot blood. One of the most influential progressive historians and Minister of Education, Jorge Basadre, wrote in 1931 and repeat this in 1978, Peru, Problem and Possibility. It has been said that blacks have lightness, improvidence, volatility, tendency to lie, lively and limited intelligence, laziness for work that the child has. His influence in Peruvian history corresponds to those characters. In short, his was a contribution of sensuality and superstition. It's really embarrassing, all these quotations. Neither of them, this is the worst part, neither of them was questioned in life for these opinions. This belief served to naturalize practices of racial oppression among literate sectors for most of the 20th century. In Peru, racism was no lack of education, but privileged access to it. Mestizaje does not eradicate racism either, but rather makes it more complex. Racial hierarchies are reproduced within the mestizo individual, which puts pressure on the whitening practice through biological reproduction. So the elaboration of a real anti-racist public policy has to overcome what sociologist Aníbal Quijano called coloniality of the power. Racial colonial hierarchies not only shape people's everyday interactions, but also epistemologies, knowledge, mode of production and consummation connected with capitalist exploitation. This coloniality is one of the main causes why state social policy in Peru repeatedly fails promoting the democratization of the country. Therefore, theoretically, any anti-racist policy must basically seek to decolonize society by deessentializing race and propose structural changes that guarantee equality among all social identities. But how to do that in Peru? A common response to social inequalities caused by racism in Peru and Latin America countries has been universal access to education. In Peru, this access usually offers equality without equity. The Peruvian system operates as if Peruvian society was monocultural and monolinguist. Hiding social diversity allows the continuity of racist prejudices that shape asymmetrically Hispanic, indigenous, Asian, Middle Eastern, and Afro-Peruvian relationships. But even discourses in curricula, handbooks, educational programs, and plans. In other words, it doesn't question the prejudices of Hispanic superiority, those of José de la Riva Agüero, José Carlos Mariátegui, and Jorge Basadre, that shapes the education system. Equality in the access within unfair structures does not solve the problem of cultural injustice. On the contrary, this can make the situation worse if subalternized groups internalize the devaluation of their own cultures and languages through the education process. The education system has worked for the assimilation of non-Hispanic to Western culture. Policies of universal access tend to offer a false acknowledge to non-Hispanic groups. They are included as long as they become Hispanic. Experiences of uprooting and self-negation are huge obstacles to build satisfactory self-esteem. Their languages, cultures, and histories has been made invisible, even banned at the school, and this process continues at college level. Many times, the internalized racism leads to looking for Hispanization as a kind of pass that allows individuals move up socially under Peruvian institutions. The anthropologist Fernando Fuensalida proposes the concept of social race to explain how one's educational level can regulate the transition from one race to another. Beca 18 Fellowship Program, college program, is one of the most recent programs for the universalization of college access. This program was created in 2012 and is focused on the young and outstanding, extremely poor students. Its ultimate goal is that beneficiaries and their families can leave poverty after graduation. This is a quotation from the document from the Ministry of Education. The true success of this program will be measured when the scholarship recipients graduate as top-level professionals and thus be able to support their families and Peru to get out of poverty. End of the quotation. Due to structural inequalities, vast majority of beneficiaries of this program are indigenous students. The Ministry of Education designed Beca 18 to assimilate these students to Peruvian university culture, which is still Eurocentric. Even tutoring services conceive assimilation as a key process for academic success. And this is a quotation. In the case of migrant students, the process of entering the university is compounded by the high demands required by the process of acculturization. End of the quotation. Therefore, Beca 18, the most important initiative to implement social inclusion in Peruvian universities, was designed only under Hispanic paradigms. No one of the universities that have received these fellows implement programs that allows recognition of indigenous cultures and languages in research and teaching. Here is fulfilled what Pierre Bourdieu noticed in The Inheritors, examining the French university in the 60s. The educational system reproduces the established order by maintaining cultural hierarchies in its study programs. Iris Marion Young defined this cultural domination as cultural imperialism. In these situations, dominant groups assume their experience and culture as having universal value, while those of the dominate are considered to be only a particular value. Under this oppression, dominated experiment what Du Bois called double consciousness. They are forced to look at themselves also from the perspective of the oppressors. An additional problem is that these practices undermine the meaning of the university. Research and teaching in universities should be oriented towards the universality. Universality gives meaning to the term university. As the poet and thinker Leopold Sédar Senghor said, universality is in the global diversity. This global diversity is the optimal condition for freedom of thought and creation. For that reason, Senghor proposed the dialogue of cultures. I think that universities are conducive spaces for these dialogues between national and global cultures. In addition to the fertility of these dialogues for research, teaching, and creation in science, arts, technology, and humanities, these dialogues can create conditions for a peaceful and worthy coexistence among all people. Offering equal access to university without offering equal cultural recognition not only denies the principle of equity, but also weakens the meaning of the university. Cultural prejudices incite marginalization, oppression, uprooting, or cultural alienation within the university campus. As the poet Aimé Césaire pointed out, oppression not only dehumanizes the oppressed, it also dehumanizes the oppressor. Affirmative action policies can help indigenous and Afro-Peruvian citizens achieve equality but no equity. These policies do not directly lead to the transformation of higher education. It is necessary to transform the institutional culture of the Peruvian academy. This process requires critically address historical, ideological, and structural discrimination against non-Western cultures, and build cultural and epistemic justice as the excess of academic teaching and research practices. Another case is the consultation law for indigenous people. In 1989, the Convention 169 guaranteed human rights and political economic autonomy of indigenous and tribal people. This convention adopted new international standards with a view to removing the assimilationist orientation of the earlier international law. A key clause of this convention is the right of prior consultation. Prior consultation is exercised when there is a state or private project that involves indigenous territories. This project needs the agreement or consent of indigenous communities to be implemented. In 2011, Peruvian state decreed the consultation law for indigenous communities. According to this law, this right will be exercised, quotation, regarding legislative or administrative measures that directly affect their collective rights on their physical existence, cultural identity, quality of life, or development. End of the quotation. Another quotation. The purpose of the consultation is to reach an agreement or consent between the state and the indigenous or native people through an intercultural dialogue that guarantees their inclusion in the decision-making process of the state. A crucial end of the quotation. A crucial process for the consultation is to determine who is indigenous. According to 169 Convention, self-identification as indigenous or tribal should be regarded as the fundamental criterion for determining the groups to which the provisions of this convention apply. However, the Peruvian law established something different about this. As you can see, there are 4 criteria to determine who is indigenous. I'm going to skip reading this because I can add that according to A criteria, being indigenous is a matter of blood ties, which reintroduces a central idea of racism, that identity depends on blood. Criteria B, C, and D require a certain immutability, segregation, and cultural purity to be recognized as indigenous. This is an imposition that limits the freedom and autonomy in the development of their own identities. These criteria are really impossible to meet, after 500 years of mestizaje, and not required of any other Peruvian social group. Moreover, this regulation creates a national registry for indigenous people. In this sense, the state reserves the epistemological capacity and the political power to determine who is indigenous. As the political scientist Manuela Pick refers in the book The Savage and the Citizen, this reproduces the colonial logic between oppressor and the oppressed. The oppressor defines who is the oppressed. The Article 15 of this law establishes this. The quotation, the agreement between the state and the indigenous or native people as the result of the consultation process is mandatory for both parties. In the event that an agreement is not reached, it is up to the state entities to adopt all the measures that are necessary to guarantee the collective rights of indigenous or native people and the rights to life, integrity, and full development. In other words, if the indigenous citizens reject the project, the state does not cancel the project, but recovers all its power to impose its will within the framework of the law. This was clearer in the regulation of this law, enacted in 2012. According to this quotation, the result of the consultation process is not binding, except in those aspects in which there is an agreement between the parties. That is, that indigenous citizens have no right to disagree. This regulation undermines the sense of the Constitution and blocks the purpose of the International Convention. Ironically, the regulation expresses the importance of the good faith and real intercultural dialogues in the consultation process. And This is the last case, the policy for Afro-Peruvian people. The Peruvian state enacted the national policy for Afro-Peruvian people this year. This is a policy for the period between 2022 and 2013. Its main objectives are to reduce ethnic racial discrimination and racism towards the Afro-Peruvian people, improve social conditions for the development of the Afro-Peruvian people, improve economic conditions for the development of Afro-Peruvian people, and increase the autonomy of Afro-Peruvian women in their diversity, and improve citizen participation of the Afro-Peruvian people. This document also defines the Afro-Peruvian identity by a common path without considering self-identification as if the past and identity were something detached from personal and collective subjective process. The definition is this, no? Afro-descendant, person of African descent living in the Americas and throughout the Africa diaspora as the result of slavery. The content of this definition is also controversial. First, the definition of Afro-Peruvians used in this policy highlights blood ties as substantial content of this identity. In some way, this definition revived the central idea of racist ideology. Identities are defined by blood. Again, a policy oriented to confront structural racism uses a tool that is central for racist ideologies. Second, this definition reproduces the dominant narrative that has reduced the past of Afro-descendants to enslavement. When even the texts published during the colonial times show us that free Sub-Saharan Africans also arrived to America. This is not a place to delve into examples, but I will mention that the first visit of the Spanish expeditionaries to a city within the territory later called Peru took place in Tumbes. Those sent as representative of these expeditionaries were one South-Saharan and one Castilian. The astonishment of the locals focused on the South-Saharan to the point that they carefully bathed him just to make sure that his skin color was natural. We can imagine how extremely pleasant such a bath can be after a long journey in those days. This is narrated in the 16th century by the chronicler Cieza de León, in the Discovery and Conquest of Peru. In the same century, another historian, Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, in Real Commentaries of Incas, described hundreds of Ethiopians walking by the streets of Cusco when he was a teenager. I don't mean to deny the atrocities of enslavement, but I don't think that it's useful to simplify the Afro-Peruvian past to it. Where there was oppression, there was also resistance, complicity, subversion, and also submission. Palenqueros, cimarrones, rebels, guerrillas, and revolutionaries are also important part of Afro-Peruvian past. History is as diverse and rich as human beings, and we must promote its investigation and reflection, not its simplification. The reduction of the past of Afro-descendants to enslavement favors their representation as objects of history, not as subjects of it. This reduction hides their agency and their struggle for their liberation and their struggle for the Peruvian independence. Narrative of victimization undermine the Afro-Peruvian people's demand for recognition, which is a matter of social justice. Inca Garcilaso de la Vega wrote in his Real Commentaries, quotation, "We forgot the best of what was imported to the Indies, which are the Spaniards and the blacks, although the blacks were later enslaved." And finally, the policy highlights that this is mandatory for all entities of the public administration. However, this policy will be implemented, how you can read, without demanding additional resources from the public treasury. Surprisingly, this policy to confront consequences of racism reproduces economic discrimination. At the same time, by prohibiting financing its implementation, the use of public resources in favor of this policy is being criminalized. In other words, due to this policy, the use of a single dollar in the implementation of this policy can be denounced as an act of embezzlement. This policy did not even include affirmative action policies to promote Afro-Peruvian access to university education. Philosophers as Nancy Fraser in Justice Interruptus have argued that cultural recognition without economic redistribution, as well as redistribution without cultural recognition, drives later or earlier at the same point of departure, social inequalities. For changing social structures historically built, it is needed the articulation of cultural and economic principles of justice. This policy contains deficiencies in cultural justice and economic justice. Okay. Part 3, the final part. These Peruvian state anti-racist discourses still assume racial categories as referring to a social reality per se. Although the principle of equality and the difference are reaffirmed to support rights to recognition, redistribution, or participation for indigenous and Afro-Peruvian groups, at the same time, they attribute essential value to blood ties. They express anti-racist but racist ideas. I call these anti-racist contradictions. These anti-racist discourses, on one hand, denounce racism. On the other hand, they define social identities based on blood ties. What is racial awareness? Many times it has been argued that we need racial awareness to confront racism. What does it mean to have racial awareness? Does that mean to self-identify with one of the racial categories? Does it mean to be aware of racial injustices? Many times, racial awareness has been understood as the acceptance that one of those categories define ourselves. In what way to assume one racial category imposed by the system derived from colonialism, it is an expression of awareness. Is there authenticity and freedom in this awareness? Am I seeing myself through the eyes of the colonizer or the races? Does this mean to remain mentally imprisoned within the racist box? Isn't this acceptance what ensures the hegemony of racism? Why not consider racial awareness as the awareness that liberates people of those colonial tools? What is the difference if I self-identify as Black instead of Yoruba? Philosopher Anthony Appiah, in Lies That Bind, proposes to deconstruct those racial identities due that they come from the colonial past. According to Appiah, the idea of race has been cause of trouble in all societies. Scientific basis of race has been dismantled since the construction of Darwin and Mendel theories. But societies still talk about race as Darwin and Mendel did never exist. I think that an important goal for democracies should be promoting social identities open to human diversity. In other words, identity that facilitate living together with peace and recognition. Stuart Hall wondered why, if race is a concept that cannot be founded by biology or science, if all reflection conclude that was socio-historical constructed, why is it still organizing our everyday experience and common sense? In other words, why race is a decisive factor for the distribution of political and economic resources. Maybe one answer is that racism is not a causal bunch of prejudices that lead to social discrimination. Racism can be a power strategy, it can be a tool for domination. In fact, racism emerged from a state with colonial or imperial aspirations 500 years ago. It is possible that racism still exists because there are still states with colonial and imperial desires. The practice of racially categorizing people has a strong effect on what Pierre Bourdieu called the habitus, the way individuals have learned to perceive the world and react to it. The habitus is constituted by our experiences inside particular social structures. These experiences shape our social views. If we socialize in families, communities, and schools where people are racialized and segregated by race, racial categories are going to become part of our habitats. Is it possible that our subjectivities has been so shaped by the frequent use of racial categories in language and practices through our socialization that before we see a human being, we see a race? What can we do in the educational arena to form no racist habitus? At what point of the social process of overcoming racism will we put away colonial racial categories? The paradox. However, how can we identify structural racism without using racial categories? Apparently, we cannot analyze racism without using these categories. But it seems that these categories cannot help us to overcome racism. In many democratic countries, the system pressures people to assume racial categories rather than to challenge it. Is it possible to overcome racism based on racial categories? Is it possible to confront racism without using racial categories? Are these categories attached to racist ideologies? Is it possible to build a non-racist society but a society organized according to racial categories? Audre Lorde warned us in 1979 that, quotation, the master's tools will never dismantle the master house, end of the quotation. Racial categories seems to be useful for the diagnosis, but not for the cure of the pathology of racism. For Appiah, Anthony Appiah, identities are process, activities, no unchangeable essence. And a society with social justice should be a place where skin color does not impose a destiny on people. At this point, Appiah recognizes the merit of existentialist theses and arguments about socio-historical processes that constitute social identities, even gender identities, as Simone de Beauvoir said in The Second Sex. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. Precisely, current feminist and LGBTQ movements are liberating themselves from patriarchal categories by creating new language to refer gender dynamics and diversity. The Dr. Charmaine Wijesenchi, in a personal conversation this year, suggests to me that this process can be a model for the construction of a post-racist language. We need a new language to think society out of the racist box. Language shapes our everyday experiences, and we need to shape them in a no-racist way. This is a pending task for multicultural and intercultural, decolonial, and critical epistemologies and methodologies. The utopia is still to approach to a freer world, a world less oppressive, a world articulated more by consensus than by domination. As the philosopher Miguel de Unamuno wrote in a letter addressed to the poet Nicolas Guillen, quotation, "We will arrive at the human color because humanity is always making itself." Thank you. Sorry for my terrible pronunciation.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful and so many different ideas to work with. So I will open the floor to questions, and you can't hear me. Oh, yeah, right. Okay. And I'll take the opportunity to put the first question in, and then maybe we collect a few others before handing it over to you. So I see where you're coming from with the argument. It makes a lot of sense to me. I understand what you're saying, but now I'm like, now what? So, okay, but now what? Because there are still such deep inequities in Peru that correlate very closely to ethnic identity or inherited identity. So what do we do with that? And so I wondered, on one hand, have you seen an example of a intervention that does not fall into this paradox of anti-racism and yet is effective? Or if there isn't an example, then which one of the three that you talked through do you find to be working the best? Do you find that it's like least paradoxical? So that is my question. But maybe I'll see if anybody else wants to ask a question before. Yes, I'll pass it over. Laura, can you reach it? Thank you.
Thank you, Luis Martín, for your presentation. I would like to come to the Mariátegui quote, because I think it's very telling of part of something that is part of Peruvian society. My question has to do not with your conclusion, but with the previous stage, and it's about the relationship between the progressive movements in Peru in the, let's say, 20th century and race, and specifically Afro-Peruvian people. I think we have noticed that many leftist and progressive groups in Peruvian recent history have not characterized to have Afro-Peruvian people as part of their constituency. So, and I am thinking right now of the most renowned deputy from, or congresswoman, congresista, black congresswoman in Peru, and she's from the Fujimorist party. I only can think of María Elena Moyano, who was a black activist who died she was martyred by Sendero Luminoso at the beginning of the 90s, but there are not many examples. So I would like to ask you, what do you think about it, and do you think does it relate with the Mariátegui quotation that you presented at the start of the talk?
Mm-hmm. I can start with these two questions and then pass to the next. Actually, if we have contact with local communities with less access to education, we can see that, so formal education, no? We can see that the categories that they use to define people are more flexible. They are more autonomous. Even yesterday we were talking with one Peruvian author, the author of Guerras del Interior. In one interview, he got this information from one Ashaninka people who said, Ashaninka is who love Ashaninka people, and that is enough. No? So it's not a matter of blood, it's just vocation, love for this community. If you love Ashaninka people, you are Ashaninka. And this is another way to understand identity, more free. I think there are these expressions in groups that are not related to political and economic power structures. On the second question, historically, the Ejército Libertador that was crucial for the independence of the South American countries was integrated majority by indigenous and Afro-descendant people, because the independence mean to end servitude and enslavement. So historically, there is a participation in this revolution. We didn't call revolution in Peru because it's like a taboo to talk about revolution, but this was a revolutionary process. And then, after the independence, the political elite went back and postponed the abolishment of slavery and servitude. However, after the abolition of slavery, that also was the result of rebellions in plantations. Majority of Afro-descendants worked first in the rural areas as peasants, and then in the urban areas as workers. And they were part of the unions that fight for worker rights. A century ago, they got the 8 hours right that was like the main goal for the unions in Peru, were the hours, the working hours were like 12, 16 hours a day, etc. So there were, in that way, Afro-Peruvians also in the leftist movements 100 years ago. Partido Aprista peruano, Partido Socialista peruano, el Partido Comunista. However, at that time, I think that racism was considered under these political theories as a matter of economic contradictions. So I think Mariátegui thought that even in the 7 essays about on Peruvian reality, because for him, the issue of indigenous people was the issue of the property of the land. No? So they assumed that solving the economic contradiction that is going to disappear the racial discrimination. At the theoretical level, but we can see that at a personal level, even in this book, he expresses some very racist ideas about Afro-Peruvians.
Thank you for a very fascinating talk, Martin. I understand the social construction of race and also the categorization of enslaved people as black, when of course that's a very created category and it serves a particular purpose. But isn't there something liberatory in claiming blackness as a fighting idea, as not just an acceptance within a structure, so coming from a position of subservience, but like with the black planter, say, black is beautiful and black and proud, and generating the very category that is supposed to demean you as an act of defiance and revolutionary force, because how are we going to break out of the structures of race without operating within it to smash it? I mean, how does it just disappear on its own, or does it start with a struggle that brings dignity, but dignity claiming the undignified categorization in a sense?
I agree with the political meaning of blackness or negritude as a political tool to fight against racism. What was questioning was the idea that this is an essence that defines ourselves. But of course, as a political tool to confront racism, I think that historically has been very powerful. And in fact, my favorite authors comes from negritude, from Harlem Renaissance, and we can see that also they are deconstructing this notion of racial categories. But they play with this tool because it's a way to articulate a vast social group that comes from different backgrounds, even if they are categorized just as black. Even in Brazil, I think it's also different than the rest of Latin America because they gave another meaning to to the word negro with this idea to revert the colonial meaning. And I agree with that, with the political. For me, to be Afro-Peruvian I am Afro-Peruvian, but it's a political identity related with social values, related with a history that I identify with. It's not the case where we think about this from racist perspective, thinking that only somebody who has this African lineage can be Afro-Peruvian. I think that this is about this is about an option. For me, basically, it's a culture. It's not something related to blood. But yeah, it's very, I can say the border is very confused. There is another question.
Hey, thank you very much for that talk. It's really interesting. When you talk about the sort of metaphors of blood that race has always been understood through, one of the challenges to that was always the mechanism. And now we have genetics, and indigenous groups in North America have, in some cases, claimed the power of genetics to demonstrate a continuity with their ancestors and use it as a similar sort of political tool. But I guess I was just curious how, if at all, genetics and those sorts of studies are playing into race and concepts of blood in Peru or South America more broadly.
Yeah, I think that here, as you mentioned, indigenous groups maybe are using this tool because the system here is based on this lineage, blood ties, to determine who is indigenous, who is white, who is, etc. I think that reinforces the idea of racism. To have blood ties is not connected with a culture or common past. No? You can assume, you can embrace even history that is not related with your ancestors. That is happening right now with families who are migrating from one country to another country. And new generations are socializing in new historical and cultural contexts. And we can see that they are identifying with these places where there are no blood ties. No? How many Peruvians families right now are in Barcelona and their children are identifying with Catalan history, and they are even, some of them, defending the Catalan independence, feeling Catalans, no? They are not connected historically with that, but they assume that history. I think that is something that is legitimate. I think it's a little bit dangerous to try in this global context to try to keep this conception of identity related with blood ties, no? Because it's a way to reproduce the racist ideology. And this is not only my opinion. Most of my favorite authors in Harlem Renaissance and in the Negritude, they talk about this, about how there is no really agenda, political agenda, or a culture connected with blood. That culture and political awareness is related with our social experiences. And that's the reason why we cannot predict who is one person based on their phenotypes or their the lineage.
My name is Patsy Lewis. I'm the director of CLACS. We're running over a bit, and I just want to thank, we lost our chair. I want to thank Professor Jessaca Leinaweaver for chairing. She had to leave at 1 o'clock. And I really want to thank Professor Valdiviezo Martín for giving a really provocative talk, really informative and provocative talk. So, and a formal welcome to CLACS this year as a Cogut visiting professor. And I want to thank the audience for your very provocative questions and keeping the discussions going, and for being present in the room and on Zoom. So thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your time.